Right, well, President Cyril Ramaphosa is meeting US President Kamala Harris in Washington. For more on this, let's cross to our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Well, it's good morning on your side, Sherwin. Let's begin by this and see that you were indeed present there as Vice President Kamala Harris was welcoming President Cyril Ramaphosa. Take us through that. I mean, we saw those visuals and we got a little bit of what Vice President Kamala Harris had to say in terms of welcoming President Cyril Ramaphosa. Take us through what's been going on this morning, Sherwin.
So before we get into the substance flow, let's just contextualize what's going on here, right? If you look at the entourage, the motorcade that has been provided to President Ramaphosa, it is quite an impressive cavalry, if you will. And the sense we are getting just from observing this is that they are really trying to woo, to court the South African president, given that this is Pretoria and Washington don't always agree on everything, particularly most recently on the issue of Ukraine. But there are other, of course, intractable issues around the world, the Cuba embargo, the Palestinian question, the independence of Western Sahara. So one is seeing a real effort from the United States, from Washington, from the Biden administration in particular, to really bring South Africa closer, whether that be in terms of geostrategies around the world and how they relate with China and how they relate with Russia and how they engage with Africa, but also on the business front. The business peg is a really important one here. So the opening remarks from Kamala Harris, the Vice President, as she welcomed President Ramaphosa moments ago, was really to say that we value your leadership and we value your influence in terms of our relationships with Africa and the rest of the globe, and we want to hear what you have to say. And President Ramaphosa really talking about some of the pressing issues that are facing Africa, the insecurity that you're experiencing in places like Mozambique, issues of food insecurity in Africa, infrastructure investment, climate adaptation, and then of course trade and investment. This is a relationship that to the tune of $21 billion in trades, in goods traded between the two countries in 2021. They want to grow that relationship. This is an important peg, given the staggeringly high unemployment South Africa is grappling with, inequality, high levels of poverty in South Africa that has only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so public health is also a very big agenda item here. The effort really is to woo South Africa. Let's see how it goes. A packed schedule. He'll come here. I'm standing in front of the South African embassy. You see the statue of Nelson Mandela that was unveiled in 2013. He will meet here with congressional leaders and with members of the anti-apartheid lobby in the United States, before then going to the White House, where he will meet with President Biden this afternoon. He will then engage with the media in a press conference thereafter, before hosting a dinner back here at the embassy with members of the United States Senate and members of Congress. Flo.
Sure, but let's talk about, the importance of this visit for President Cyril Ramaphosa. We understand his first visit then to the White House. And interestingly, you mentioned the fact that, the U.S. is trying to show that, we value South Africa's influence. And I was reading something that you put up about, it was a transcript from a senior U.S. admin official that was previewing discussions with President Ramaphosa and Biden. And you said that, the U.S. seemed to be eager to hear South Africa's perspective on how to reach a conclusion on the conflict in Ukraine. And that was very interesting to me, because I thought to myself, well, what does South Africa have to offer in that regard? Of course, South Africa has played, it has been in the middle when it comes to sorting out some issues in Lesotho, for example. But on a global scale, one, seeks answers as to, what do we have to offer in those kinds of conversations regarding conflicts that large?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that call. This was a call by a senior U.S. administration official yesterday, really laying out their perspective in terms of the visit by President Ramaphosa. And just listen, Flo, to some of the things they say. President Ramaphosa is a COVID-19 champion. It should be no surprise that the two leaders are meeting so soon after the release of the U.S. strategy for sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa is a leading country in Africa and an important voice globally in ending COVID, reversing the tide of democratic backsliding, particularly in places like Africa, but not exclusively to Africa. We think of Myanmar, for example, responding to the global food crisis and shaping the rules of the international rules-based system. I mean, they are really providing accolades here to Pretoria. So there is really very much a courting happening here. As the world faces growing divisions, we cannot make progress, they say, on our shared global priorities without South Africa's leadership. And on the matter of Ukraine that you raised, as the conflict has evolved, we are eager to hear South Africa's perspective on how we reach a conclusion to the conflict and what are the means to do that, right? This is a shift in the posture, right? All we have been reporting on for months is how the United States is providing arms to this conflict. They are now saying we want to listen to South Africa's perspective, and we want to listen to South Africa's perspective in particular as to how it relates to ending this war. What are the means of doing that? So that is going to be a very substantive conversation, given South Africa's roles in a multilateral fora like BRICS. Who's in BRICS? China, US adversary. Right. Who's in BRICS? Russia, Chinese adversary. Who's in BRICS? South Africa, friend of the United States. Maybe there is a role here for South Africa. At the beginning of this conflict, President Ramaphosa, you'll recall, talked about a mediation role for South Africa. What might that look like? That's what they will be discussing today.
Yeah. Interestingly, on the back of that, Minister Naledi Pandor and Secretary of State Antony Blinken also sort of meeting ahead of these meetings. And I must say, Minister Naledi Pandor has seemed, rather harsh on South Africa's stance when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, in many instances, in emphasizing the fact that South Africa is going to be neutral in all instances. Do you see, I'm looking at how President Cyril Ramaphosa has been so warmly received in the US, and how, as I think the word you used was, how he's being wooed, really, that we might see a situation where South Africa might need to sort of bend, when it comes to this particular issue of neutrality, bearing in mind that that's a difficult situation, and you rightly raise that we are part of BRICS, and it's very difficult for South Africa to kind of pick any side when it comes to this particular conflict.
Look, I think the President has a different posture to the Minister of Foreign Relations, because she was very robust in our conversation earlier this week at the Council on Foreign Relations, because the question posed to her by Jendai Fraser, who was a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State and a former ambassador to South Africa and a current fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, was to say, hey, you were pretty sharp in your rebuke of the United States when they invaded Iraq, but we're not seeing the same level of rebuke afforded Russia in terms of its invasion of Ukraine. And so why is there not that sort of egalitarian view from South Africa in terms of the violation of an independent state sovereignty? And what Minister Pandor said in response to that was, look, we cannot ignore history. The Russians were there for us during the struggle, and sometimes the American government was working with the apartheid government against our leaders, killing our leaders. And so, people sort of sat up straight in their chairs when they said that. And so I don't know how far that goes in terms of bridging the divides that we know exist from a geopolitical point of view between the two countries. But I think that what you'll see from President Ramaphosa is a smoothing over perhaps of those ructions today in terms of what South Africa might be able to offer in terms of the relationship between Russia and the United States, because Ukraine is a pressing issue in terms of the energy deficit that countries are facing, in terms of the food insecurity that countries are facing, particularly in Africa. So it's going to be curious to hear from President Ramaphosa today what he's been able to extract from that discussion with President Biden at the White House this afternoon.
All right, as we wrap up our conversation, Sherwin, when are we going to see the two leaders emerging? I saw President Cyril Ramaphosa, they took no questions from you guys as you were standing there at the steps. But when are we expecting to see them sort of emerge and come out? And kind of, will they, sort of talk about what came out of their breakfast meeting? And I mean, I would ask you what they're eating, but, that's tabloid. But in any case, what are we expecting to, to hear after this?
So he's at the Vice President's residence, which is just up the road behind me, and then he'll come down here to the South African Embassy, where he'll host congressional leaders and members of the anti-apartheid lobby in the United States. I believe they'll serve South African food, but don't quote me on that. It is the South African Embassy. I'll be disappointed if I don't see a bunny chow. And then later he'll go to the White House. He'll meet with President Biden around 9 p.m. South African time. They will make opening remarks in the Oval Office. Brief remarks. I'm sure you've seen those visuals of the U.S. President hosting a head of state with a seat near the fireplace in the Oval Office. They'll both make 3-minute remarks each. The President will then go into a meeting with President Biden. We'll then exit the Oval Office. We'll be able to tell you what those remarks were soon after that. The President will do a press conference later in the afternoon and then host a dinner back here at the embassy later today. So we'll try and get you as much information and as quickly as we can flow, so we can keep you both informed and on point.
Always a pleasure, Sherwin. Thank you very much. Let's catch up later on. That is our correspondent in the US, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who's currently stationed in Washington, D.C., where President Cyril Ramaphosa is, in fact, currently having a breakfast, well, we call it brunch, meeting with Vice President of the US, Kamala Harris.